Thank you all for joining today for our InfoTrust webinar around privacy-centric data collection, and specifically today really digging into Google's new consent mode. Obviously, first-party data collection is a huge topic of conversation right now, specifically around some of the various different privacy changes that are happening in the industry, both regulatory as well as technical, and some of the different strategies and ways in which we can mitigate some of the risks and still be able to collect complete, accurate data to be able to really drive business decisions. And Google's new consent mode is a tactical method that we can really start using to address some of those different concerns. Let me just kind of get a couple of housekeeping items out of the way. Number one, who we are, who I am. So that's me. Actually, I think I have the same shirt today as the one in the photo, coordinated well. But I am the product manager for our software platform, Tag Inspector, and then also work with a number of our client organizations and partner organizations on all things privacy, both from a strategy standpoint as well as more tactical and even implementing some of these different solutions such as consent mode. InfoTrust, what we do, we are an analytics consulting agency. So we're Google Cloud as well as Google Marketing Platform partners. We have offices across the globe, and we conduct a number of various different educational sessions, such as these regular webinars on many, many different topics. So with that out of the way, also quick disclaimer, I am going to be talking about some different consent requirements and some of the various different regulations. At the end of the day, I am not an attorney. These are kind of my interpretations for any final decisions that you're making around consent and consent mode and implementations at your organization. Always have to call out, do need to get that advice from your own legal counsel before making any kind of final calls in that regard. So, also one other item for questions. I'm here for you all, so I would love for this just to be a conversation. I'm going to go through all the different content here. If there are any points that you have questions on, anything that is unclear, please let me know. You should have access within the Zoom webinar pane, little Q&A area. So drop your questions in there. As soon as I see it, I have it open so we can dig into any of those different topics really as they come up. So very happy to do that on the fly and make this as helpful and beneficial as possible for you. So throw them in the Q&A, we'll answer everything or as much as we can, I guess, as we're going through. And then at the end, we'll also have some time to answer questions. So to get off on the right foot, a few different important definitions that we'll be using here today. And I want to make sure everyone is on the same page. So first, when we're talking about tags, we're talking about the JavaScript code on a website that is the mechanism via which both data is collected, the platform functionality, and then it's also how cookies are set and accessed in most cases for marketing and advertising platforms today. So tags, JavaScript that's running, collecting data, as well as setting and accessing cookies. When we're talking about cookies, specifically, cookies are small text files that are placed on the user's browser. These are typically used to save information, most often in the form of a user identifier. It's saved there for later reference. So sometimes people confuse cookies and tags. They are different things. Cookies, the small text files, tags, the actual scripts responsible for setting cookies and collecting information. We're going to talk about consent in a few different kind of contexts here, but the important one to really note is explicit consent. When I'm talking about explicit consent, I'm talking about consent that is requiring the user's explicit indication of acceptance prior to whatever that activity that they're consenting to is happening. Personal data, which is the definition within GDPR, is any information that can be used to directly or indirectly identify a natural person. And then personal information, which is a little bit more of a broader definition. It's used in US regulations, specifically CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, is information that identifies, relates to, describes, is capable of being associated with, or could reasonably be linked directly or indirectly with a particular consumer or household. These definitions are important because they speak directly to what we must get consent potentially, or allow users to opt out of. So with those definitions in mind, let's talk consent. What are the actual requirements of an organization? And what is it that consent mode, and what is it that we're addressing with things like consent management and these consent mode solutions? So when we're talking about consent, we're talking about needing to get users to consent to some action that we're doing under various different privacy regulations. The first one, and the one that is most important, and the one, most important really in Europe for consent purposes, and one of the big things that consent mode really addresses are the e-privacy directives. Now, the e-privacy directives, or more kind of colloquially known as cookie laws, are the laws in Europe and country-specific directives requiring the consent to the usage or the accessing of a user's terminal device. So what this means is for cookies to store that information on the user's browser, or to access and reference information stored in a cookie, we're needing to get explicit consent. Hence that name of cookie laws, is because that is what really required those banners notifying you of the usage of cookies, and then now requiring that consent prior to the placement or the accessing of those cookies. Now, GDPR, and this is where oftentimes many people get confused, is that GDPR requires a legal basis for processing of personal data. So it's more so speaking to the data that we're collecting, not necessarily just the cookies that are being set in place. But what GDPR did was that it codified the definition of consent, and it made any reference to consent, and this retroactively applied also to the e-privacy directives, that consent must be explicit, informed, and freely given. AKA, you have to have explicit consent that we talked about before, even for accessing the user's terminal device, i.e. in this context, setting cookies. So when GDPR was introduced, it codified and it strengthened those requirements for the e-privacy directive and what we had to do in Europe in order to leverage platforms that used cookies. Now, CCPA in the US takes a little bit of a different stance, and it does not have any consent requirements, but it does grant users consent requirements in the context of explicit consent. But it does grant users choice in opting out of, today, the sale of personal information. And then with an update in 2023, due to the CPRA, which passed this past year, it extends that opt-out right to the sharing of personal information. And then some of the new state-specific laws, like the CDPA in Virginia, has a specific call out for the use of any information for profiling purposes, for advertising. And that kind of seems to be the standard in the US. So what that means is that users will have a right to opt out of your use of their personal information for purposes of profiling them and then using that for ad targeting. So consent here is a few different requirements, if you will. Most stringent requirement being that explicit consent required in Europe under the e-privacy directives for the placing and the accessing of a user's device. Now, why is this important? Why do we go through the minutia of the consent requirements? Well, because instead of addressing the specific requirements, today, implementations and cookie management platforms and how we're implementing that with respect to our tags and first-party data collection is we're just a one-size-fits-all approach. how that management is happening is that because the tags or those scripts that are embedded on our websites are responsible both for the collection of information as well as for the setting and the accessing of those cookies. When a user opts out or when a user does not explicitly consent, what we're doing is just not firing or not executing those tags on the page. So the impact here is that in order to comply with privacy regulations or specifically related to the placement and the accessing of cookies, we're also not collecting any information. Same thing, in order to comply with consent requirements for not even necessarily the collection of personal information, but how we're using that downstream, we're also then cutting off the placement, the accessing of any cookies, and the collection kind of at its root. So the problem is that the tag is responsible for both the collection as well as the placement and accessing of the cookies. And in order to comply with these consent requirements, we're just cutting off both and not running that tag at all. So traditionally, to kind of think about this in a little bit more of a concrete example, traditionally for first-party data collection, think analytics on your website, you'd at least be able to view the behavior of probably around 98% of users. Most of those pseudonymous users, so users that just have an anonymous unique identifier, think client ID within Google Analytics. But we'd at least be able to see, what are those users interacting with, what's being interacted with on our websites, how many conversions are happening. And we could tie those actions together with just at least that user. We have some proportion, a smaller proportion of users that are logged in, named, and so that we could tie that information together for a longer period of time and have more context. But this was kind of the traditional situation. Now in Europe, again, because we are modifying and not executing those tags, period, in order to comply with cookie requirements, we now have a situation where for many websites, around half of their users and half of the interactions on their websites they're not collecting any data. So there is no observed interaction, there is no observed behavior that's happening. And worse yet, we have no baselines to even understand what proportion of the information that we are actually collecting, we are actually reporting on, what proportion does that make up of the overall scope? So we can't even do model based upon that incomplete data set. Now, in the US, because it is that opt-out approach, it's not nearly this kind of dire, if you will, at the current time, but it is moving in that direction. Some of these new privacy pieces of legislation, they make it far easier for users to opt out. And as a user, I'm thrilled about that. And they kind of codify some of those different areas and mechanisms via which a user can opt out. So we're seeing adoption of those things really tick up. And as that adoption ticks up more, we get closer to this type of a scenario. Maybe never get this level, but get far worse than what it is today. So in order to be able to really fill in this full picture and be able to reclaim and at least be able to report on interactions, how many conversions are happening, what products are being viewed, what content is being consumed on our website, we need some sort of a method to at least collect anonymous data collection without setting cookies, as well as to modify the nature of the data that's being collected so that we can comply with those laws and comply with the user's choices regarding the usage of their information for, say, advertising, but can still solve use cases like optimizing the website experience and being able to report on those conversions and optimize our campaigns. So this is kind of the reasoning behind consent mode. And it is what consent mode solves for. And it's why it becomes so critical, really, as you're thinking about any kind of tagging architecture and data collection architecture moving forward. So an overview of what consent mode is that it is a mechanism to modify tag behavior for today Google products by default based upon the user's indication of consent. So instead of not executing these tags because the user hasn't consented, we can still load these tags, but their behavior will automatically change based upon the user's consent choices. Now today, where this is built into are, again, the Google tags. So Google Ads tags, floodlights, as well as Google Analytics, both universal as well as GA4, as we'll talk about here in a bit. For universal analytics, there is little to no utility in this, at least for reporting. But for GA4, it's huge. So that's what this is built in for. And what, as mentioned before, allows you to do is load these platforms for all users. And then the technical behavior is modified based upon the user's consent indication. It does require a script to be added, which will indicate the consent preference, which can then be read by Google Tags. And you can configure this script to read from your consent management platform. It's a question that always comes up. Well, does this mean we have to redo our InfoTrust configuration or redo our Evidon configuration? No, it does not. The consent management platform still manages the consent experience of the users. It still manages the recording of consent and all of that. What consent mode does is reads from that indication and then provides a flag, if you will, to the Google tags so that they modify their behavior accordingly. Now, also kind of important to note here, support was also introduced just under a month ago, May 27th, for other tag templates to also respect consent mode indications. Some functionality is built into GTM to better support these configurations, which we'll dig into a little bit later. So it is very feasible and really for me expected that other third parties will begin embedding this type of functionality where their tags behave differently based upon users' consent moving forward. And Google's making that possible so they can build those into their templates that will then be available within GTM. As far as the indicators, so we talked about the indicators that consent modes kind of raises. And these are ads storage and analytics storage. Now, these are the two indicators that the Google tags will read from. There are 3 additional storage types as kind of configurable within GTM that you can then use as conditions for loading or not loading other tags. But these are the 2 that we'll focus on here because these are the things that the Google tags will modify their behavior based upon. Now, the ads storage indicator is an indication if the Google tags can read from and set storage information, i.e. cookies, on a user's device for advertising functionality. For analytics storage, this is an indication if Google tags can read from and set storage information on a user's device for analytics functionality. We'll talk about the specifics of how they're modifying their behavior for these two ways here shortly. There are some additional options. I mentioned the additional indicators that can be used within GTM. The Google tags today just read from these 2. So also some additional options for ads data redaction. So it's an additional ads data redaction. So again, the tag will modify its behavior even more. I'm going to redact some query string information from hits that are being sent when this is enabled, and then URL pass-throughs, which has been something that's been enabled within Google Tags or available within Google Tags for a while. You can also set this option within the consent mode indication. One quick question here, it looks like, which we can jump into. When I said the impact of consent mode is huge for GA4 compared to universal, does this mean there is minimal benefit in pushing for consent mode until someone is already using GA4? But as of a month ago, I would have said yes. But after Google introduced some of these updates within GTM, yes, you're not going to see any value within your universal analytics reporting by configuring consent mode with it. And again, we'll talk about some of those specifics here in a bit. But the value of you leveraging consent mode in order to play with some of the new GTM functionality for managing conditions of consent and being able to more simply do that within your container. If you are using GTM and GA, I would say even for universal analytics, it makes sense to introduce this, just because the management of tags with respect to how you're handling conditions for triggers and things like that becomes a lot easier. And we'll talk about some of those specifics here in a moment. So these are the 2 indicators within the consent mode script, and then those additional options. What these things mean. So what is enabled, what is disabled when ad storage and or analytics storage is either granted or disabled. When both are granted, more or less the tags will operate as they have in the past. For cookies pertaining to advertising are able to be read and written, IP addresses are collected, the full web page URL, including ad click information, is collected, and then third-party web cookies previously set on Google and DoubleClick, as well as first-party conversion cookies, are accessible. So imagine if, like for Google Analytics, for example, that you had enabled advertising features, and then all of your Google Ads tags were also implemented. This behavior is going to be like that. So for your consenting users, if users consent to all of the different categories of cookies and everything, then you would set both these to granted. The tags are going to behave as normal. Where they begin being modified, or the behavior is modified, is when you begin denying either ad storage or analytics storage. So when ads storage is denied on web, no new cookies pertaining to advertising may be written. No existing first-party advertising cookies may be read. Third-party cookies may be sent, but only limited for usage and for spam and fraud purposes. Google Analytics will not read or write Google Ads cookies, and signals features will not accumulate data. Full page URLs are collected, which do or may include ad click information, but that information will only be used to approximate traffic measurement, so only used for measurement purposes, not for audience purposes or anything like that. And then IP addresses are limited to just the country. So more or less here, how that behavior is modified is that ads cookies are not set nor accessed, and then advertising functionality or processing of data that's collected for advertising purposes will be restricted or will not happen. So again, thinking to Google Analytics as the example here, think about if you were still running a Google Analytics tag, but you had disabled advertising features in the past. That is kind of what ad storage being denied looks like. The next piece, and kind of one step up for limitation of processing of information and how cookies are being handled for advertising purposes, is if both ad storage and ads data redaction, ad storage is denied and ads data redaction is set to true. In this case, again, no new cookies pertaining to advertising are going to be read nor written. Requests are sent through a different domain to avoid previously set third-party cookies from being sent in request headers. So more kind of protections against third-party cookies being set. Google Analytics will not read or write ads tags. Ad identifiers are redacted. IP addresses are at the country level, and then page URLs with ad click identifiers are redacted. So again, further limitations to processing for purposes of advertising. So this would be like if ads in Google Analytics, if your advertising features and ads personalization were turned off, as well as some further redaction of any kind of ad click identifiers and campaign identifiers within page URLs. This is meant to satisfy some of those limitations on processing as it relates to ads for some of those US legislations. So for users that have opted out of the personal information usage for purposes of profiling and advertising. Finally, if you deny also analytics storage, then on web, none of those Google tags will read nor write any first-party analytics cookies. Fully cookieless pings or hits will be sent to Google Analytics for base measurement and modeling purposes. And then just the note there that Google Optimize is not affected. So what this means is that the Google Analytics, again, will not be setting nor accessing any cookies. So things like your client ID, it's going to essentially just be a random number on every new page load. But GA will be sending data and will be sending hits about the events, conversions, those specific interactions up to GA. So what I mentioned before for Google Analytics and why there's no real value in consent mode for universal analytics versus GA4 is because universal analytics relies on that user and session-based data model. For a session to be calculated, or for multiple page loads or multiple interactions within the same session to be correlated together, it requires that client ID or that persistent identifier for that user. If no cookies are being set nor accessed, then that client ID is refreshed. And again, it's essentially a random number on every single new page load. So there is no way of tying together interactions into the concept of a session. Without sessions, then there's no way of tying those together for the concept of a user. So what happens when consent mode is turned on and you're collecting that for GA tags that are running is that the information will still be collected if you're running the universal analytics tags, but that information is just suppressed and not surfaced within reporting. Now with GA4 and the event-based data model, everything is built around just those interactions. And so things like base level basic measurement, so conversions, interactions, transactions, product views, page views, those metrics are able to be surfaced within reporting. So you're able to have that fully observable, can kind of fully observe the behavior of users on the website. And then also Google is working on modeling within reports. Modeling is already applied and live within ads. And it allows them to, based upon the baseline information, as well as information collected for those consenting users, where there are cookies and there are identifiers, there is then modeling built into reporting to help with things like attribution reporting, measurement optimization, or campaign optimization, and user flows and funnels. So that is also being built into to GA4. But again, it's reliant on that event-based data collection model. And that's why when everything is disabled or denied, it makes sense to leverage within GA4, but not universal. So just to kind of quickly review here, traditional versus consent mode behavior, how it differs, specifically for Google Analytics. Traditionally, the user is going to load a web page or perform some tracked action. Your GA tag will execute, and at minimum, it's going to read or set first-party cookies, and it's going to send data to GA servers containing, again, just at minimum, page URL, that user's client ID, or that unique anonymous identifier, and it's also going to send any configured page and user data. So, as well as additional analytics and or advertising functionality can be enabled or disabled. But regardless of that, that above will always happen. Now, with consent mode, a user, even in this case, if both ad storage as well as analytics storage are denied, user loads that web page, the GA tag executes, reads from that consent indication from the consent mode script. No cookies are read nor set. Anonymous information is sent to Google Analytics for that aggregate and statistical measurement and modeling. So how this works, if you're looking at the actual hits that are sent, when those are denied, it's indicated within a new parameter that is passed within the Google hits. That indicates the consent status. Again, any hits collected with a GCS parameter are not surfaced in the universal analytics reporting, but interaction data is presented within GA4. So what this allows us to get to, if we think back to just that kind of initial visual model of close to half of our users and half of the interactions just being completely untracked, is with consent mode, we're introducing a new bucket, more or less, of observed information. And that is completely anonymous information. So we have no user information. We have nothing that can be used or classified as personal data that can be used to identify a natural person, nor do we even have anything that with which we can associate any actions of users together with. So we don't even have personal information under that CCPA definition. We just have purely aggregate statistical information of what actions have happened. So that becomes a new bucket of data that we have. We still have our pseudonymous, so those users that consent but do not register or name themselves. And then we have a proportion of users that have named themselves, that have registered, signed into our websites. So we have a persistent first-party identifier for those. So this gives us back that full picture, at least for observing those actions and interactions, how people are interacting with our web and digital properties. So that's how the tags differ in their behavior and kind of the problem that it solves there in order to mitigate some of those risks and some of those issues as it relates to measurement problems with users that have not consented. Now, in addition, about a month ago, GTM also had some updates that were introduced for consent mode. And what these do, you can really think about them really in just 3 different categories, was that we introduced new trigger types, which are called initialization triggers. There were updates made to tags where you can apply consent settings to tags. And this is a complete shift where you're applying any conditions of when a tag should load or how a tag should behave. Instead of applying those conditions to the triggers or to the logic of that defines when that tag executes and runs, instead you're applying it to the tag itself, and it's managed there within the tag, which makes the management within GTM a lot simpler. And then there are also management updates made. There's a new single consent view, and then within that you can view the consent conditions that are applied for each of the tags, and then also make mass updates to those. So let's take a look at these in a little bit more depth. So the first update was those new trigger types. And so if you've been in a GTM container, you've certainly seen these. And they are what Google is calling initialization triggers. Now, the first one is consent initialization. It's the first thing that GTM is going to execute. And then following that is an initialization trigger, and that happens after consent initialization, but before standard trigger types. Now, while these happen, and any tags which you have applied these initialization triggers to are going to run first, they don't fully support asynchronous requests, meaning that the scripts will run first, but they're not guaranteed to finish their execution before the standard triggers are initiated. And this causes an issue, because what often will happen if you run your consent management platform on consent initialization, and then you also run your consent mode, the default script, to read from that consent indication and then set the default value of either enabled or disabled for the Google tags, is that often that consent mode indication will not be made until after tags that are set to load on page view have already begun to execute. So they won't respect those options. So What we've begun to do is we'll actually push an event with the consent mode, the default initialization script, and then use that event instead of the page view for any tag that should run on the initial page load in order to be able to take care of that timing problem. But that timing problem is the exact reason for which Google introduced these trigger types. And it does make the setup and the configuration of your consent management platform and then the tags and how they're respecting those consent choices a bit simpler. So it does free up a little bit of space. It's not perfect though quite yet, which is part of the reason why all this is still in beta. The next update was to the tags themselves. So as mentioned, it's a shift from managing the consent settings and the consent conditions that tags need to respect, moving those from applying them to triggers to now applying them to the tags themselves. So you have these built-in consent checks, which are on by default and they're already predefined. These are the things that the Google tags today are respecting. And other tags, there is that ability now to build that logic into a tag template, a custom template, and so third parties can begin doing that. There are also additional consent checks, and these are for either ad storage, analytic storage, functional storage, personalization, and security. Think of these as the like categories, cookie categories that you would be applying to trigger logic before. Again, unique, you would apply that to the trigger and then apply those triggers to tags. Now you can move that directly to the tag itself. GTM will read the consent mode indication for each of those storage types, and it will stop tags from executing if the consent check, that storage type that is associated with the tag, is disabled. GTM handles that itself. And so what you're able to do is go back to just managing the triggers without any conditions for consent applied to the trigger itself. Apply it and embed it within the tag. And then all triggers respect that additional consent checks, again, for that conditional firing. It replaces the need for conditional trigger logic, which is huge. So that question before about does it make sense to leverage this until you've migrated to GA4? No, from a Google Analytics perspective, but yes, from a GTM and tag management perspective, because this can really simplify that configuration for respecting consent. The final update here, as mentioned before, is those management updates. So if you can see as that kind of animation runs there on the right-hand side, you're able to view consent settings that are applied to tags all in one place. You're also able to bulk edit consent mode settings for tags. Now, you enable this, you do still have to enable it within the actual, the admin, the settings view within your GTM container. But once you do, you can then see any consent settings that are applied to the tags themselves, and then again, make those bulk updates. This simplifies just the visibility into how consent is configured for the various different tags, and it simplifies management so much. And it's going to make ongoing governance of containers much, much simpler in the future as well. Because if you're working with any partners or any agencies that are also in there deploying tags for you, today they have to follow a lot of complex logic and requirements for adding those conditions to the various different triggers. Here, you can simply manage, and if they do make a mistake, you can even go in, see that very clearly, very cleanly, and make those updates within this new interface. The other kind of management update, as I've mentioned a couple of times, custom template sandbox APIs for making tag templates built in GTM, consent aware, or having that ability to read and adjust the behavior based upon the consent mode indication. So more tags, not just the Google tags, will be able to just automatically modify their behavior of setting cookies and providing indications for not processing certain types of data and ways in which it's processing just built into the native functionality, which is going to even further simplify things and really drive a lot more first-party data collection in that anonymous, privacy-safe way to accomplish a lot of our measurement use cases while not having to worry about the kind of advertising effects of that. So all of this is well and good. All of this looks awesome. How do we set it up? What are some of those implementation requirements? I'm not going to get into a ton of the nitty gritty here, but kind of at a high level, you can use that gtag.js or a GTM implementation in order to set this up. And what it requires is an additional script that contains a call to the gtag function that needs to run before, first it was just before Google tags, because those are the only ones respecting these conditions, but it needs to run before any tag that has that consent mode indication built into the tag template or any of the Google tags that you're running within that GTM container. So that initial script, it defines the default behavior. So in Europe, for example, that's going to be all of those different storage options being denied or and then updating that once the user makes a consent selection and then carrying that forward from page to page. Usually, in order to carry that forward, you're having to read from the cookie that's set by your consent management platform to provide that indication. It also then requires a second script containing update calls to that GTag function to run following any consent indications of users. So this, within a lot of the consent mode platform or consent management platform tags, they have callback functions that can be leveraged for this. And this is basically just enabling those different storage options as users do consent to them. But a lot of the CMPs are beginning to support these updates natively. And so they're automatically making these updates and these calls to the GTag function when users are interacting with their platform and are granting consent. So this is being kind of worked on and being built in already and makes it a lot easier. Finally, I mentioned it before, but it's really important to reiterate, you do use that consent indication from the consent management platform to dynamically update the values in those functions and those values for what's enabled, what's disabled. The consent management platform is still managing the consent experience of the user. Google is not introducing something that provides those options for users and disclosures to them around what they're consenting to. That's still managed by the consent management platform. Consent mode is just a kind of a technical underpinning that is reading from those consent indications and then making those consent indications available to be used by GTM, the Google tags, any of those other tags that have that functionality built in. Kind of just to summarize some of the benefits and considerations here. Benefits are that ability to provide more granular functionality control based upon the consent indications of users. If a user consents to advertising, enable advertising functionality. If they consent to analytics, enable analytics functionality. If they don't consent, we still at least can have that fully anonymous first-party interaction data collection that's just collected in that aggregate statistical manner and still allows us to optimize our site experience, optimize our content, and view and report on things like conversions. So having that control versus the all or nothing approach that's really been traditionally relied upon up until this point. By having that fully anonymous data within that reporting, it allows us to, and allows platforms, in this context specifically Google, to introduce modeling into reporting to fill in those gaps in observed behavior. And so you can model things and still understand from both our named user sets, our consented user sets, and our anonymous data sets to be able to understand user flows, conversion paths, attribution, all of that. But you have to have that anonymous data in order to be able to feed into those models to make that effective. So all in all, it has the potential to lessen measurement impacts of those consent decisions while fully respecting the targeting decisions and the privacy of users. In addition, those GTM updates greatly simplify tag management and governance, reducing that need for those additional trigger conditions, makes everything just so much cleaner, so much simpler moving forward. Some of the considerations here, there is a compliance determination. While that functionality does stop any storage access, it does not block hits from being sent. I talked about the consent requirements. Again, you need to have that conversation with your compliance department to be able to really get the thumbs up for this. But it should address the actual regulatory concerns. Another call out here is that this functionality is still in beta. It is still changing some. I don't see it going away for sure. This is, again, critical for any kind of a first-party data collection architecture moving forward, this type of functionality. It being in beta, we always like to joke, it's Google, so it'll always be in beta. But the updates that are being made, there seem to be more updates being made to simplify this process. So if you're running just, a single website or handful of websites, it makes sense to set this up for sure. If you're planning a much larger rollout across, 100 websites, 1,000 websites, something like that, it might make sense to at least start piloting this and playing around with it on some websites, but waiting until some of the architectural aspects of this become a little bit more concrete, so you don't have to redo that implementation or rollout in the future. Also, that consideration, again, the GA4 data model naturally supports this functionality. And so while it's technically supported for UA, not going to see value there, this is another reason to begin that migration to GA4 if you haven't already, because it can help significantly with measurement there. With that, I know I saw that there were a number of questions. Try to leave a little bit of time here at the end so we can dig into these. So feel free to drop questions in, like a number are in the chat, but also in the Q&A, and I will look at that. First question here, is it correct that Safari and Facebook have both said they are blocking this? I have not heard that at all. I also don't see a way that Safari and or Facebook could block consent mode functionality. You might be referring more to like the Flock proposal within Privacy Sandbox, which making those cohorts and things like that available. Certainly, there's a lot of contention about that at this time, but for consent mode and how it works for like GTM on your owned and operated properties, Safari, Facebook, no, wouldn't have any real ability to do anything for this. Next question, do you have any recommendations for how to make it 100% transparent to consumers what they are consenting to? Yes, that is, well, regardless of if you're using consent mode or if you're not using consent mode, it's critical. Both from a regulatory standpoint, as well as just doing right by the consumers, making them aware of exactly what processing behavior is happening and what, how those tags are operating, what information is being collected, how it's being used, what the impact is on those users. Consent mode doesn't change that. What consent mode actually allows you to do is actually be doing the things that you're saying in those transparency kind of disclosures. So yes, even if you are using consent mode, it is still critical to be properly disclosing those. We can follow up on that further. So basically, there will naturally be a decrease in the amount of data we have based on the consent settings a user chooses. Naturally, kind of, I guess. Yes, there will be, if you are actually respecting the user's consent choice. If a user is not consenting to the collection or the processing of information for advertising purposes, then you shouldn't be processing information for advertising purposes. In today's method of how that's managed, again, it is that we're just not executing advertising tags. With something like consent mode, that process or how that's handled shifts to still collecting information and using it for just general measurement, but not using it for advertising, or collecting information, using it for measurement, but not setting and reading cookies. Question here, if in universal analytics, if we have 10% users did not consent, and these users are browsing the same number of pages per session, does it mean we are inflating our user count by about 10%? In this case, if you have consent mode enabled, you would not see any of that browsing data of those users that have not consented. Assuming you have all this set up within universal analytics. So no, you're not going to see any changes to like your user counts in that sense. Universal analytics, any data that's collected with consent modes and analytics storage disabled, within universal analytics, that's going to be suppressed and not included in the reporting. So you wouldn't see anything like being inflated or deflated in that context. A question if consent mode is required for GA4. It is not. I wouldn't be shocked though if Google kind of combines them in some way and really embedded this consent mode functionality into the native tags themselves. In many ways, it is. I mean, if you're deploying those through GTM, then it's already included in the tag logic. All you have to do is just make that consent mode indication for the indication of the consent choice of the user, and the Google tag is gonna respect it. So, and modify its behavior accordingly. So while it's not required, it's only getting more easy to set up, and it doesn't make any sense not to, I guess. So it's more of a requirement by utility than by forcing. A question here of recommending for implementation of consent mode now or only once they sunset universal analytics. For analytics purposes specifically, again, you're not going to see a whole lot of value from consent modes within like your analytics reporting until you move to GA4. But that's only for analytics tags. Remember that Google Ads tags also respect and use those consent mode indications. You can see value from implementing consent mode in those platforms today, because there you're also able to, again, collect conversion data within Google Ads that you wouldn't be collecting if you're not executing that tag. And you can collect that and have that information for measurement purposes and campaign optimization and conversion reporting. You can have that within reporting without setting and accessing those cookies. So you already can see some value there just for reporting in those platforms. But Google has also already introduced modeling into those reports. And so if you're using consent mode for that anonymous data collection, again, within Google Ads, you're also going to have some modeled insights to be able to really close the loop and give you more insights into overall campaign performance, campaign optimization, attribution information, really all of that. That again, you wouldn't have if you're not executing those tags for those users. If you're not executing those tags at all for those users that have not consented. Awesome. Those are all the questions that I'm seeing in the chat as well as within the QA. So I hope this has been helpful for everyone. As always, anyone that has any questions, please reach out to us at InfoTrust. We support partners globally on consent implementations, consent mode configuration, anything that has to do with first-party data collection, as well as really optimizing and actioning that information. So let us know if we can help in any way. Thank you all very much for joining today, and we hope to see you on future webinars.